Dr. Bradley is the founder and CEO of the Institute for Energy Research based in Houston, with also major operations in Washington, D.C. He's the author of 7 books in energy and energy history, most recent being Edison to Enron, Energy Markets and Political Strategies. And he blogs regularly at Master Resource. He also has a number of affiliations, adjunct scholar at the Cato Institute and the Competitive Enterprises Institute, as well as having been a visiting fellow at the Institute for Economic Affairs in London, and an honorary research fellow at the Center for Energy Economics at the University of Texas at Austin. So on Samuel Insull, here's Dr. Bradley.
Well, thank you very much. It's good to be back at the Atlas Summer Seminar. This is my 5th time in the last 6 years. My only worry is I'm running out of topics to impress William Thomas. But the subject today is probably a new one for you. If I ask the audience, how many of you know about Samuel Insull, there'd be a few hands raised. Roger Donway there, no fair. Marcia Enright, no fair. Jennifer Bradley, no fair. But it's okay if you don't know about Samuel Insull, but he is a figure that is certainly one of the great ones in the history of American business. When you think of the great early U.S. industrialists that really, in an atmosphere of freedom, launched our own industrial revolution here in the United States, some familiar names: John D. Rockefeller, who rationalized the petroleum industry. He understood economies of scale, in scope, integration, watching your pennies, numerous advances that lowered the cost of petroleum, turned it from a luxury into a necessity for Americans. And he also improved the quality of the product. Standard Oil, he standardized it. And it's hard for us to believe, but in the old days, in the 18th or the 19th century, you could start a lamp with kerosene and it could blow up in your face. It was like automobile accidents to us. But Standard Oil not only made the product affordable, but they standardized the quality where such accidents virtually disappeared. Henry Ford and the automobile, well known in all the textbooks, mass production, turning into mass consumption, and the two go together. J.P. Morgan in finance, providing capital for lots of startup businesses, the major funder of AT&T, General Electric, as we'll see, the railroads, etc., and Andrew Carnegie and steel. And these were prime movers. These were great industrialists that not only were company builders, they really built the whole industry with their ideas, their capital, their profitability. But the name that you hear very little about is Samuel Insull in electricity, but he very much did for electricity what these other gentlemen did for their industries. Arguably, Insull was America's leading businessman of the 1920s. Mr. Electricity in his half-century career. At the peak, his companies controlled 1/8 of the United States consumed electricity, consumed electricity, 39 states. He was Mr. Chicago. He moved to Chicago in 1892, and he built up the city as he built up the industries, beginning with electricity, but he also got into coal gas, turned it into natural gas, and the traction industry. In Chicago, he was a go-to financier, philanthropist. He was a real kingmaker. At his peak in the late 20s, Insull presided over a $2.5 billion empire. In today's dollars, maybe that would be about $30 billion. His personal stake, $150 million, and a dollar was worth a lot in the 1920s. Today, that would have made him, in today's dollars, it would be more than $1 billion, but there weren't many billionaires in his day. Forrest McDonald, who wrote a great biography of Insull, and I'd recommend it to everyone, he called Insull the Babe Ruth, the Jack Dempsey, the Red Grange of the business world. Here's a cartoon of Samuel Insull in one of the leading magazines of the day, 150 companies beneath him. Everyone, it seemed, worked for Insull, electricity, natural gas, traction, and he was in some other businesses as well. Time magazine cover story, the great Samuel Insull. In other words, you could make a case that Insull was the most well-respected and successful businessman of the 1920s. And there's others like Rockefeller who were retiring. Henry Ford, by this time, was on the downside of his career. Now, with electricity, Insull co-built with Thomas Edison the company we now know as GE, General Electric, over about an 11-year period, and I'll discuss that in a minute. Insull developed the business model for the modern electricity industry, beginning in Chicago and going out to the Midwest and much of the country. Insull was also the father of public utility regulation of the electricity industry, and we'll talk about that some. But the key thing is that Insull's entrepreneurial genius in a free market setting of where you could retain your profits, where you could attract outside capital, he turned a luxury product into a necessity. Now, why Samuel Insull at an Atlas conference? His business building was really the epitome of heroic capitalism. And to me, a major part or a major theme of Ayn Rand's writings deals with heroic capitalism, where self-interested activity of business leaders, entrepreneurs, have social benefits for all of us. Insull was extremely disciplined and reality grounded. You could say he was an implicit objectivist. And that's a term I like to use for leading business figures who are very reality grounded, who are just great decision makers, who practice tough love, either before Rand came along or after Rand came along. If they never studied objectivism, still they got it. And a lot of objectivism is a common sense. So business success is important, and a lot of business success has to do with implicit objectivism. Insull had a great fall. We'll hear that in part 2 with Roger Donway later in his career. And he got in some bad habits, and that has happened a lot, where a person, maybe they get promoted once too many, or they stay on too long, or maybe they're too successful, they get into bad habits. It happens, and it happened to Insull on the backdrop of the Great Depression. So it wasn't all his fault. There were external matters too. And Insull went from business victim to political victim, and that will be the subject of the next talk by Roger Donway. There's a quotation I like in this regard. It is, "In a nation built so largely around the accomplishment and values of business, we should pay more attention to our business history." Now, Insull meets Edison. There's a whole story here. This is in my book, Edison to Enron. Good copies are still available. Some academics have given it praise, and my mother has said that 5-6 pages will get you right to sleep. So some of you could get this book for different reasons, but there's lots of reasons to get it, right? Insull grew up in England. He was a child prodigy with business. He went to work in his early teens to support the family. He was just brilliant. He worked all the time. When he wasn't formally on work, during his weekends and holidays, he was still studying business, studying the technical side of the business. And as fate would have it, he got fired from one job for reasons of cronyism. And he looked in the paper, and there was a job available. He interviewed and got it. It turned out it was for the European representative of Thomas Edison. And in that job, Insull quickly immersed himself in all the activities, reading all the cables back and forth between London and New York City, Menlo Park. He became intimately familiar with Edison's business. He spent time with the engineers who were working on the beginning of the telephone industry, and they were using some electricity and lighting that came from the United States. And a position became available for Thomas Edison. He needed a new personal assistant in the United States, and Insull got the call. So Insull got on a ship at age 21, traveled 3,000 miles from Liverpool to New York City, gets off the boat at dusk, meets Edison, and they pull an all-nighter, and Insull explains to Edison how Edison can raise $150,000 of European capital from the different major financial centers of Europe. And an Edison representative gets on the boat to go back. And in that all-nighter, Edison realizes that Insull is just brilliant. He understands accounting, business, and within weeks, or in the first couple of months, Insull becomes the secretary of all of Edison's companies. And within 2 years, Insull has power of attorney for Edison. Edison was a bad businessman. He did not like to go to board meetings, and Insull really took over the business side of Edison. Edison was an inventor. He wasn't a good businessman. And Edison is starting businesses, building the dynamos, the early electric generators. And that was a core business that became General Electric. Edison also had a lighting company making the lighting fixtures. Edison had other related companies. The common denominator was in electricity. And Edison himself, I might just spend a minute on him. He was an implicit objectivist. Edison was the inventor of all inventors. He had nearly 1,100 different patents, but in the prime of his life, Edison focused on electricity. Edison saw electricity as his, quote, field of fields, quote, end quote, giving him the opportunity to, quote, reorganize the life of the world. It began with his study of arc lighting and his review of the gaslight industry in the late 1870s, and Edison became confident that he could subdivide the great beams of light. And Edison, in his prime, focused on electricity. Here's a good description of Edison. Edison was neither a theoretician nor an ivory tower experimenter. He was a practical inventor. Quote, "I find out what the world needs, then I proceed to invent," he said. The market's verdict was taken as his own. "I measure everything I do by the size of a silver dollar," Edison said. "If it doesn't come up to the standard, then I know it's no good. He once complained about an assistant's work at Menlo Park, quote, "We can't be spending time that way. We have got to keep working up things of commercial value. That is what this laboratory is for. We can't be like the old German professor who, as long as he can get his black bread and beer, is content to spend his whole life studying the fuzz on a bee." A practical inventor. And Edison often complained about how we were doing too many things with our own time and hands. He said, quote, "I am ashamed at the number of things around my house and shops that are done by human beings. Hereafter, a motor must do all the chores." Electricity was really a new form of energy. And some say that it really sparked the second industrial revolution. All the things that we take for granted, like in this room, electricity is the energy. And if we had to fool around with kerosene, fuel oil, gasoline, coal, natural gas to do all these things, it would be extremely difficult to do. We wouldn't have nearly as much to do. Within 2 years, as I said, Insull, this 21-year-old and now 23-year-old, is basically running the businesses of Edison. And it was a tough, tough time. They were always short of capital. J.P. Morgan capitalized Edison at $500,000 and wasn't getting the returns that he realized. And at one time, they almost went under. And I'll give you a quotation just to show you how bad it was and how when you get discouraged about yourself, maybe you're exaggerating and things aren't as bad as you think. Edison and Insull hit bottom. Personal resources depleted, badgered by overdue bills, and reduced to dining on credit at their beloved Delmonico's in New York City. Edison remarked to Insull late one evening, quote, "This looks pretty bad. I do not know how we are going to live. I think I could go back and earn my living as a telegraph operator. Do you think, Sammy, that you could go back to earn your living as a stenographer?" As Insull stated decades later, "That was the only time I ever saw that man lose courage." Wow, that's at the bottom. So, in the 11 years that Insull spent with Edison, Edison built up the company that became General Electric, and it was a big one. There was a reorganization. Edison, as I mentioned, was not a good businessman. J.P. Morgan felt like there needed to be changes. So J.P. Morgan and the majority stockholders of what was then the Edison General Electric forced Edison out, and it became General Electric. But in the reorganization, Samuel Insull, age 31, was a number 3 executive at the GE. Insull felt like he needed to be number 1. And at the farewell party, or the, Insull was an employee for just a couple days, and he informed his 2 superiors that he was going to leave. And they had a farewell party for Insull at Delmonico's in New York City. And they're giving nice toast to Insull, and Insull gets up and says, "I'm going to join a new company, as you know, in Chicago Edison. It's 2% the size of General Electric, but before I'm through, it's going to be bigger." And everyone is, who is this kid? Why is he saying these things? But Insull, he did have an ego, but he was extremely talented, and he would end up being more or less correct. I'm sorry, it was 1%. His new company was 1%, the size of his old one. So what Insull decided to do here is to go from manufacturing, which is General Electric, to the distribution business. And the electric distribution business is all the way from generating electricity to retailing it, selling it to homes and businesses and industry. He takes a big salary cut, but he gets authority from the board to construct a central station plant. Now what's important here is at the time you were generating electricity in what they'd call isolated plants or dynamos, very small, and they were located on site to serve maybe a city block or two. And Insull saw the future of electricity in central station plants, big plants, where you then turn to transmission to get the electricity out to great areas. Insull comes to Chicago in 1892 and he starts buying plants, his competitors. The biggest biggest electricity company in Chicago, the head of it invited Insull to lunch to talk about things, and Insull at the lunch announces that he's going to buy the other person's company. He's like, what? Well, Insull was able to do that, and what he would do is he would buy these other companies, he would close down their dynamos. Insull had a quotation that his number one asset was a scrap heap, and Insull would turn it over to a central station where you got much greater economies. So Insull had to do a lot of things at the same time to accelerate the growth of the electricity industry on generation, sales, rate design, vertical integration, going all the way back to the coal fields. And coal was the one fuel source for electricity. If it wasn't hydro, it was coal. It was pretty much a coal industry. The key thing, well, electricity, let me backtrack a little bit. Electricity is a very unique, different product. Electricity is something that the instant it is produced, you have to consume it. There's virtually no storage. It's just too expensive. And the business model for something like this, where you have to instantaneously consume it, is very tricky. And in the early days, Edison and others were trying to figure out how do we price electricity, and they generally had a flat rate. If you use a little or a lot, it's the same rate. Then they went to incentive rates where the more you use, the more the price went down. But what was happening was they were building plants to serve demand at the peak, at its peak, and then they were losing money, and they just didn't understand the economics. And Insull was on vacation just 2 years after he moved to Chicago to run his own company. Chicago Edison was its name, and it later became Commonwealth Edison, which is still the name today. Insull's on vacation in England, and he notices at night the lights are on with these businesses, and how can they afford that? How do they understand the economics? And he found out that they had a meter, and the meter recorded not only your total usage from which you could get an average, but it also recorded your peak usage. And by understanding peak usage versus average usage, you could go to two-part rates. One rate is a demand charge, a fixed charge, and the other rate is your volumetric rate on how much electricity you use. So the economics changed here, where if you have a customer that's very peaky but only uses electricity, a lot of electricity 1 hour a day, they would pay a high demand charge because you are having to build a generator and build transmission as if that person was using that much the entire day. So this is called load factor. The load factor is your average usage versus your peak usage. So your real peaky customers that are really very expensive to serve because you're making all this investment for really 1 hour of the day versus other users that use it more during the day where they're giving you more volumetric revenue. So the load factor is real important. And two-part rate design was really the way that the industry was able to economically calculate, to use a term from Austrian economics. So Insull is all focused on the load factor. Regular lighting, maybe that's a 20% load factor because, during the day, most of the lights go off, but, dusk through at least the early part of the evening and early morning, people turn on their lights. Well, that's 20% of what the machines can produce. So Insull got very busy with the gospel of consumption to promote his product. And the idea is to get the load factor up from 20% to 30% to 40% where the economics worked. And to do this, everything had to come together for him with production, consumption, and we'll talk about that here in a second. But for the first time in history, you have a bunch of analysts that are going through all this data on usage per person, per hour, per area to figure out the economics. And Insull would give speeches on this, and he educated the whole industry on the right model for electricity, this very tricky product that had to be consumed the moment it was produced. Massing production. The generators in the early days, in Edison's early days, it got up to 1/10 of a megawatt, okay, early 80s. Adams Street, built in 1891, 3 megawatts, so there's a factor of 30 or more. And Insull, once he took over from over at Chicago Edison, got in touch with Charles Coffin, the head of General Electric, and said, how big a generating plant can you build for me? And Coffin went 3 megawatts. It's the most that our engineers can do. And Insull, who was a real student of the industry, said, well, I've been to England, and they're building bigger units. You need to go 5 megawatts. And Coffin, no way. Build 5 megawatts. Do it. Insull had an intuition of what could be done in the industry, and he pushed GE real hard to make the bigger, not dynamos, but central station generators. And by massing production, he's getting the cost way down of electricity. 1912, you're up to 20 megawatt units, and they'd put a number of these in one plant. 30 megawatts by the 1920s. So the cost of production is going way down, and whereas 7-8 pounds of coal created a kilowatt hour in the 1890s, early 1890s, Insull got that down to a third of that. Insull worked very closely with Frank Peabody, the creator of, or the founder of Peabody Coal Company, which is still very big, the largest in the U.S. The gospel of consumption. You got to sell this stuff. And Insull understood the more users you have, the more people use electricity at different times, and the load factor can go up. This was huge. So there's economies of scale in consumption, not only production. And now Insull knows how to price his product with two-tier pricing. Gospel of consumption. Oh, Insull did everything. He had a big old marketing department. And he made Chicago, quote, the electric city. He would have, vehicles, trucks with appliances that would go through the, would just, circle around so people could see them. The Electric City magazine, the latest in appliances, electric appliances he had in this, in the house to your upper left, and they would park that in different places, and you get the housewives to come look at it. It's great. One of the most famous advertisements in the history of advertising was with electricity, and this is an Edison ad, Commonwealth Edison, where they're telling the husbands of the house, the breadwinners, you know, if you buy lots of the latest electric appliances, your wife will be a better mother. She'll have more time for motherhood, and she'll live longer. There'll be less stress, and it goes over all the arguments. But Insull would do all sorts of things. He would take the latest appliance, he'd put it on an airplane, and he'd fly it around, and heck, this is the first time this has ever happened, and it makes the papers and all. So he's selling GE products as much as he can. So it's supply and demand. Corporate culture is very interesting. The inspiration for Samuel Insull was the wisdom, the self-help books of Samuel Smiles. A lot of you probably don't know about Samuel Smiles, but to me, he was the Adam Smith of applied capitalism. Applied meaning you go to work in a private property profit loss situation, and you try to make profits and succeed. And Smiles' book, Self-Help, written in 1865, is really the beginning of all the self-help books we know today. And the Smilesian wisdom influenced Insull very much. Books like Character, Duty, Thrift, and it's the common sense, perseverance, not genius or luck, adages like that. And Insull had these Smilesian qualities of discipline, perseverance, attention to detail. He was a master doer, teacher. He was very much an intellectual, and he was authentic and humble. In corporate culture under Insull, what Insull was able to do at Chicago Edison, later Commonwealth Edison, was just amazing. All the perks. He began, every Christmas you get a turkey. And then he said, instead of the turkey, I have another option for you, life insurance policy. And the workers were, I don't want to take the turkey. And Insull didn't like this, so they kind of phased out the turkeys. But an employee could get $500 worth of life insurance. And the company was buying life insurance at a third, 1/4 of the cost of what you could otherwise buy life insurance for, because they were doing it in scale. He got all his employees very involved in community projects as a public utility, and every employee became a stock salesman. The person that would check your electric meter, knock on the door, would you like to consider buying some stock in Chicago Edison? They had parties, wild parties. They had sports clubs. Insull even bought a recreational property 100 miles, I think it was northwest of Chicago, where up to 400 employees, including members of their family, could go take a vacation at a very low subsidized rate. All this was to increase spirit, and working for Insull was considered the best job you could have. The Dean of Women, Helen Norris, her job was to handle issues relating to the interaction of the sexes. At the beginning, there was like one ladies' restroom in the whole, 15-story Edison building. And she handled a lot of issues that would come up, but women were entering the workforce, and it began with World War I. But the model then was ladies worked, but they'd get married and they wouldn't work anymore. And Insull would always talk about how wonderful it was that the women working for his companies, they couldn't do better than to find their husband also working for an Insull company. Welfare capitalism was a term that came out of this. 40-hour weeks were implemented instead of 60. Profit sharing and retirement plans, stock ownership plans, free medical, unemployment insurance, and it was observed, quote, Insull tried to kill his employees with kindness. So he's not only making a lot of money, always reducing rates from his improving economies from his scale up of business, but employees are benefiting very handsomely. A couple minutes on rural electrification. Insull starts in Chicago, then he moves out to the suburbs, and that was a natural. But then he bought a farm, 7 miles away from the closest generator, and he wants to electrify his farm, so he starts experimenting in building transmission out to the farm and then to the area that he's in. And the industry thought that Insull was going to lose a lot of money through serving the countryside, but guess what? The load factors improved. That the usage of electricity on the farms was different enough from in the cities that the incremental cost was very, very low. It's basically the price of coal and the transmission lines. So he solved the economics of rural electrification long before during the New Deal. The FDR started spending a lot of taxpayer money signing up or getting electric service to the farms. Networked power, rather than every region building its own generators, they hook up with transmission so that if there's outages or problems, that they can all rely on each other. This is a vast network over long areas, and Insull was at the forefront of this, a real network of electricity. Insull was a political capitalist. He was very concerned on the one side of local authorities passing rate ordinances or something very arbitrary. On the other side, there was a threat of municipalization. And Insull said, given all this uncertainty, the best solution is statewide, scientific, public utility regulation. You regulate my rates, but I get an exclusive franchise to serve this area for 30 years. And it was a trade. And there's a lot we could talk about there. But you ask yourself, why do we need public utility regulation of electricity where you're just stringing wires up on poles? But that's a whole nother topic, and maybe we can address it later on. I'm going to jump ahead just to my conclusions, but Insull put it all together, and he put it together for a very unique, tricky commodity, electricity. I think his innovations are easily in the same vein as the great U.S. industrialists that you know a lot about. And certainly Insull was a hero in so many different ways. He had so many good values. He was a wonderful businessman. He was a great doer. And I would say he was very much an implicit objectivist. But things change with the Great Depression, and later on in Insull's life, for complicated reasons, he feels that he hadn't done enough. He needs to do lots more, and he starts doubling his bets. And Insull goes steaming into the Great Depression, thinking that the Great Depression is going to be temporary. He follows the advice, or he's very influenced by Herbert Hoover, who had Insull and other leaders come to the White House, where Hoover said, it's business as usual, expand, invest, just like you did during the heyday of the 1920s. And from there, problems occurred, and I'm going to let Roger Donway run the final leg of this two-part race. So with that, I'll open it up to some questions or answers.
So interesting. I have two questions, one real quick and one a little longer. One is, how did Insull get his financing when he first came to Chicago?
He had a great board of directors, a superior board of directors, including one of the top bankers in town. And before he took the job, he got a commitment from his directors that they were going to get him a lot of capital so he could build a big central station plant.
Now, the other one is about something about Edison. I don't know if you know or not. But if Edison was such a great inventor, businessman, and an implicit objectivist, why was he so awful to Tesla?
Well, he had problems with Tesla, but Edison had more problems with Westinghouse. Westinghouse invented the alternating current versus the direct current, where it was much more efficient over longer distances. And Edison, you know, that's a good point. Edison had a real blind spot to some of his fellow competitors, and he wasted a lot of money and energy fighting AC, thinking that his DC was the best, and that cost him. And later on in Edison's career, he started making a lot of problems. He was losing a lot of money on different ventures, and one of them was building an electric car for his good friend Henry Ford, which was a mistake. Edison said, oh, we can get the battery for you, but that was a big waste of effort.
In the beginning of your speech, you had mentioned Rockefeller and the development on the energy industry. When the Sherman Antitrust Act attacked Rockefeller and broke up his oil industry into 35 different units, my understanding, that occurred May 15th, 1911, he realized it was essentially a declaration of war, the United States versus his oil empire, and then he started encouraging people to go into Congress, Sam Rayburn from Texas and a number of others, to build up a base there to protect themselves. Do you see any of the other titans doing things like that over time, looking at Sherman Antitrust Act and so forth as threats, like what the oil industry did?
That's a great question, and probably an antitrust expert could help you there. But what happened with Rockefeller was very unique, a major antitrust case and a dismemberment of his company. Insull was really on the other side of regulation. Insull, he persuaded his fellow CEOs that statewide public utility regulation was the way to go. So in that sense, he was a crony capitalist. He was very good at it, and it was, and it worked for him, except for during World War I, where the authorities were not okaying cost increases in a timely manner. Public utility regulation worked fine for Insull. But what Insull was doing was, you have a maximum rate here set by traditional public utility regulation. Insull's rates were below that. Insull had like 18 straight rate decreases, voluntary. He didn't need regulators to tell him to drop rates. His model depended on what they called at the time ridiculously low rates. So Insull's experience with regulation was quite different from Rockefeller.
You mentioned the young Insull boasted that he would take his small company, 1/100th the size of GE, and end up being bigger. How did he do on that?
Oh, I'd have to ask Roger to research that for us. Insull's company, I mean, it got to, what was the number I had? 1.5 billion? Was that the, so I'd have to look at General Electric's capitalization at that time in 1928. Need to do that. Thank you. Roger?
Yeah, the thing was that Insull did not have just a single company. So comparing Commonwealth Edison to GE would be quite fair, because he had
150 companies, yeah.
Yeah, in addition to Commonwealth Edison, we had Northern Illinois Public Service, we had Middle West Utilities, and so on. So it's not quite apples to apples.
But his holding companies. Commonwealth Edison, I guess you'd have to compare that to General Electric, and I'm sure General Electric would be better. Well, thank you very much for being here and for your attention.